Some people believe revenge brings peace, but the cruelest revenge is often the one we prepare against the person who once sacrificed everything to save us. Damian Sullivan had built an empire where hesitation did not exist. Every decision carried weight, every promise demanded loyalty, and every betrayal was remembered long after everyone else had forgotten. That was why, on a cold October evening, every detail of his final plan had already been arranged with the same precision that had made his name one of the most respected in New York. A black luxury sedan waited quietly outside Sullivan Holdings beneath the glow of the city lights, while two trusted members of his security team stood nearby, checking the time without speaking. They knew where they were going. They knew why tonight mattered. What they did not know was that everything was about to change before the engine ever carried them away. Inside his private office, Damian stood alone before a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking Manhattan. The skyline stretched endlessly beneath the fading sunset, its towers reflecting gold against the Hudson River. Resting upon his polished walnut desk was a single photograph inside a silver frame. It showed a smiling woman standing beside him during a charity fundraiser almost 2 years earlier. Once, she had been the only person capable of making him forget the ruthless world waiting outside his office doors. Now, according to everything he had believed for the past 6 months, she had become the reason trust no longer existed in his life. Damian slowly turned the frame face down. "Some debts cannot be forgiven," he said quietly. His chief of security nodded once. "The arrangements are complete." Damian slipped into his charcoal overcoat and walked toward the private elevator without another word. 20 minutes later, before continuing with his personal plans, protocol required him to make a brief appearance at the annual fundraising gala hosted by St. Catherine Medical Center, the very hospital where surgeons had fought to save his life after a devastating car accident half a year earlier. Crystal chandeliers filled the ballroom with warm light while physicians, nurses, donors, and community leaders celebrated the opening of a new patient recovery center. Damian moved gracefully through the room, shaking hands, exchanging polite smiles, and thanking supporters without allowing any conversation to last more than a few moments. His thoughts never drifted far from the evening that still waited beyond the hospital walls. As he quietly stepped into a side hallway leading toward the parking garage, a gentle voice stopped him. "Mr. Sullivan." Damian turned. Standing several feet away was a nurse wearing light blue scrubs beneath a neatly pressed white coat. Her identification badge read Grace Parker. Her warm brown curls rested neatly behind her shoulders, and although the long shift had left traces of exhaustion across her face, her calm eyes carried remarkable determination. She held a slim medical folder carefully against her chest. Damian searched his memory, but found no recognition. Grace offered a respectful smile before speaking again. "You probably do not remember me," she said softly, "but I remember every day you spent here." Damian glanced toward the waiting exit where his security team stood patiently beside the elevator doors. "I am afraid this is not a good time." Grace tightened her hold on the folder, but never stepped closer than necessary. "I understand," she replied. "But if you leave this hospital tonight, you are about to spend the rest of your life punishing the one person who quietly saved it." For the first time that evening, Damian remained completely still, and the certainty that had carried him through 6 months of anger suddenly felt far less certain than it had only a moment before. Damian remained motionless in the quiet hospital corridor as Grace's words settled between them with unexpected weight. Behind them, the charity gala continued exactly as before. Soft piano music drifted through the ballroom. Guests exchanged polite laughter beneath crystal chandeliers. Doctors thanked generous donors, while volunteers guided visitors from one display to another. Yet inside Damian's mind, the evening had suddenly divided into 2 separate paths. One still led toward the revenge he had planned for months. The other had appeared only seconds earlier, carried by the calm voice of a nurse he could not remember but somehow found impossible to ignore. Grace never attempted to block his way. She simply held the slim medical folder close to her chest, allowing silence to do what arguments never could. Damian finally looked toward his waiting security team near the elevator. With a small gesture of his hand, he instructed them to remain where they were. They exchanged puzzled glances but immediately obeyed. Turning back to Grace, He spoke in the measured voice that had guided countless negotiations. "You have 5 minutes." Grace nodded with quiet gratitude. "That is all I need to begin." Together they stepped into a small family consultation lounge overlooking the hospital courtyard. Warm lights illuminated benches where visiting families quietly talked beneath autumn trees, completely unaware that a different kind of life was being changed only a few floors above them. Grace placed the folder gently on the wooden table, but did not open it immediately. Instead, she studied Damien's face with the careful attention of someone trying to determine whether another difficult truth could still be heard. 6 months ago, she began softly. You arrived here without the ability to make decisions for yourself. The emergency department moved quickly because every minute mattered. Surgeons prepared the operating room. Nurses coordinated medications. Specialists arrived from different departments. During those first hours, no one cared about your reputation or your business. You were simply a patient whose life deserved every possible chance. Damien listened without interrupting. His memories from those days remained little more than scattered flashes of bright lights, unfamiliar voices, and long stretches of darkness. Grace continued. After your surgery, I worked several recovery shifts on your floor. You remained unconscious much longer than your doctors originally expected. Every morning, I reviewed your chart before checking your condition. Every evening, I completed another set of observations before leaving the hospital. She paused briefly before adding, there was one detail that never changed. Damien slowly folded his hands together. What detail? Grace looked toward the folder. Someone came to see you every single day. Damien frowned. My advisors told me only hospital staff were allowed extended access. Grace gave a faint, almost sorrowful smile. That is what you were told. She finally opened the folder, revealing carefully organized photocopies of nursing notes, visitor records, and recovery summaries protected inside transparent sleeves. None of them appeared extraordinary at first glance, yet Grace handled each page with remarkable care. When the hospital converted older paper records into digital files a few weeks after your discharge, she explained, I noticed something that never felt right. She gently slid 2 nearly identical visitor authorization forms across the table. Damien leaned closer. At first, both documents appeared identical. Then he noticed a single handwritten signature on one copy that had completely disappeared from the archived version. Grace quietly rested her hand beside the papers. I believed it was an ordinary clerical mistake, she said, until I found the same missing name again, and then again, and then again. Damien felt the certainty that had carried him through 6 months of anger begin to weaken for the very first time. Grace lowered her voice almost to a whisper. Someone did not erase those records because they were unimportant. Someone erased them because they told a story you were never supposed to hear after you opened your eyes. Damien lowered his eyes to the visitor forms spread across the table, reading the same missing space again and again as though repetition might somehow produce a different answer. It never did. Every altered document carried the same silent absence, and the pattern felt far too deliberate to dismiss as coincidence. Grace carefully arranged the pages into chronological order before sliding another protected sheet toward him. Unlike the visitor records, this page contained handwritten nursing observations recorded throughout the first week after his surgery. Most entries described medication schedules, vital signs, and routine examinations. Near the bottom of one overnight report, however, a single sentence had been highlighted with a small yellow tab. Familiar female voice appeared to calm patient. Visitor requested privacy. Damien read the line twice before looking back at Grace. Who wrote this? He asked quietly. Margaret Ellis, Grace replied. She supervised the recovery unit for more than 20 years before retiring shortly after your discharge. Damien traced the handwriting with his eyes. Did anyone ever ask who the visitor was? Grace nodded slowly. Yes. The answer existed in the original paperwork for only a few days before revised copies replaced it. She reached into the folder again and removed 2 nearly identical recovery summaries. At first glance, they looked exactly alike, but the older version contained handwritten initials beside one authorization, while the archived copy displayed only a typed notation indicating that administrative corrections had been completed. Damien leaned forward, his attention narrowing onto every detail. Hospital's revised documents, he said, almost as though trying to convince himself. Grace answered with gentle honesty. They do. But they do not repeatedly remove the same person from every related record unless someone intentionally wants that person forgotten. Silence settled across the room. Outside the window, families crossed the courtyard beneath warm lights while nurses ended another demanding shift with tired but genuine smiles. Life continued peacefully beyond the glass. Yet inside the consultation room, one quiet discovery was dismantling 6 months of certainty. Damien slowly closed his eyes. Faint fragments of memory drifted back without warning. A gentle voice reading softly beside his bed. The comforting scent of lavender lingering after visiting hours. A warm hand resting lightly across his shoulder before disappearing into darkness once more. He had always believed those moments belonged to dreams shaped by medication and exhaustion. Now they felt strangely real. Grace noticed the change in his expression but waited patiently before speaking again. Sometimes the mind protects itself by hiding painful memories until the heart is ready to understand them. Damien opened his eyes and looked toward the final document still resting unopened inside the folder. Does that paper tell me who she was? Grace rested one hand upon it without uncovering the page. It tells you who accepted responsibility when you could not speak for yourself. It tells you who remained here after everyone else went home. And it tells you why the story you have believed for 6 months was never complete. Damien felt his phone vibrate inside his coat pocket. Without looking at the screen, he already knew the message had come from the security team waiting for instructions to continue the plan he had prepared for so long. This time he ignored the vibration completely. Some decisions could wait. The truth could not. Grace took a slow breath before quietly adding the words that changed the atmosphere once again. The name you are about to see is not dangerous because it exposes the past, she whispered. It is dangerous because once you know it, every decision you plan for tonight will become impossible to justify. Damien looked at the unopened page resting beneath Grace's hand, but for the first time in years, he discovered that certainty had become far more frightening than doubt. Revenge had always been simple because it demanded only conviction. The truth required humility, and humility was something power could never purchase. Grace quietly studied his expression before sliding the final document across the table. The paper showed signs of age unlike the newer copies surrounding it. Fold marks crossed its surface, and the ink had faded slightly, yet every handwritten line remained clear. Near the bottom of the page, beneath the section authorizing emergency treatment while the patient remained unconscious, one elegant signature stood alone. Damien slowly lowered his eyes. The name belonged to the woman he had spent 6 months believing had abandoned him when his life collapsed. He read it once, then again. Neither time changed what he saw. His breathing slowed as memories buried beneath months of resentment began quietly returning. He remembered hearing a familiar voice speaking softly somewhere beyond the darkness. He remembered a hand gently adjusting the blanket across his shoulders. He remembered the faint scent of lavender drifting through the room before everything disappeared again. None of those moments had been dreams. Grace carefully removed another document from the folder. This one contained a handwritten note completed by the attending physician after Damien's surgery. Visitor remained throughout postoperative observation. Authorized continued treatment until patient stabilized. Requested no public acknowledgement. Damien stared silently at the words. Why would she hide everything she did? He finally asked. Grace answered without hesitation. Because her goal was never to be thanked. Her goal was simply to make sure you survived. Damien lowered his head. Every conversation he had replayed in anger during the past 6 months suddenly felt incomplete. Every accusation he had believed now rested upon a foundation that no longer existed. Grace reached for one final sheet containing overnight nursing observations recorded during Damien's recovery. One short sentence had been underlined by hand. Patient responded positively whenever familiar voice present. Damien closed his eyes as another forgotten memory quietly surfaced. Someone reading from his favorite novel beside the hospital bed. Someone promising that tomorrow would be easier than today. Someone whispering that he was not alone, even when he could not answer. He had spent months convincing himself those moments belonged to medication and imagination. Now he understood they had belonged to someone whose kindness expected nothing in return. Grace folded her hands together before speaking again. The official report you received after leaving the hospital never included these pages. Damien looked toward her. Who removed them? Grace shook her head gently. I did not know at first. I only knew every revision erased the same person while leaving everything else untouched. She paused briefly before continuing. That pattern was never an accident. Damien's phone vibrated again across the table. This time the message came from his chief of security asking whether the evening's plan should proceed. Damien looked at the screen without touching it. The answer that had once seemed obvious no longer existed. He slowly locked the phone and placed it face down beside the folder. Grace watched the quiet gesture without saying a word. Sometimes the smallest decisions revealed the greatest changes. Damien finally looked back at the original signature resting before him. If someone wanted me to believe she betrayed me, he said quietly, then someone else benefited from that lie. Grace met his eyes with calm certainty. That was the question I hoped you would ask before it became too late. Damien remained seated long after the phone screen had gone dark, his attention fixed on the original documents spread across the table. Every page carried quiet evidence that could not be explained away by coincidence. One altered form might have been a clerical mistake. Two might have suggested carelessness. But an entire chain of revised records removing the same woman from every meaningful moment of his recovery pointed towards something far more deliberate. Grace sensed that his thoughts had finally shifted from anger to understanding. She carefully gathered the papers into chronological order before sliding one final section of the folder toward him. These were never included in the archived file, she said softly. Inside rested handwritten notes completed during the first 48 hours after Damien's surgery. Unlike official summaries, these pages captured the small moments that rarely appeared in legal documentation. One nurse recorded that a familiar voice seemed to calm his breathing during difficult periods of recovery. Another noted that the same visitor refused refreshments because she did not want to leave the room for more than a few minutes. A third entry described how she quietly thanked every member of the medical team before returning to the chair beside his bed. Damien read each sentence slowly, as though every word carried the weight of months he could never recover. She stayed through all of this, he whispered. Grace nodded. She arrived before visiting hours whenever permission was granted, and she left only after the evening shift assured her. Your condition was stable. Damien continued turning the pages until he reached a handwritten consent form completed only minutes before an emergency procedure became necessary. The signature was the same elegant handwriting he had already recognized. Beneath it, a short physician's note explained that immediate authorization allowed treatment to continue without dangerous delay while additional family members were still traveling to the hospital. Damien rested both hands upon the table. The woman he believed had abandoned him had instead accepted responsibility when no one else was there to answer. Grace quietly continued. After your condition improved, she asked only one thing of the physicians. Damien looked up. What did she ask? Grace smiled faintly, though sadness remained in her eyes. She asked that no one tell you what she had done unless you wanted to know the truth yourself. She believed gratitude given because someone felt obligated would never mean as much as gratitude discovered honestly. Silence settled across the room once again. Damien looked through the lounge window toward the softly illuminated courtyard where visitors embraced loved ones before heading home. Until that evening, he had believed strength meant never questioning a decision once it had been made. Now he understood that real strength sometimes began by admitting a painful mistake before it became permanent. He reached for his phone, opened the unanswered message from his chief of security, and typed only 4 simple words. Stand down. Cancel every meeting. After pressing send, he turned the device off completely and placed it inside his coat pocket. Grace noticed the quiet decision but offered no praise. She knew that choosing compassion was not the end of the journey. It was only the first honest step. Damien carefully closed the folder before speaking again. Someone wanted me to remember only the pain. Grace nodded. Yes. He looked back at the preserved documents resting between them. Then tomorrow I begin finding the person who rewrote my past. Grace held his gaze with calm certainty before answering. When you begin following the truth instead of your anger, you may discover that the person hiding behind those altered records has been standing much closer to you than you ever imagined. The following morning, Damien arrived at Sullivan Holdings before sunrise, carrying the medical folder with the same care Grace had shown the night before. The executive floor remained almost silent, with only the distant hum of cleaning crews echoing through the polished hallways. For years he had believed every important answer could be found inside financial reports, legal contracts, or boardroom discussions. Now he understood that the most important truth of his life had been hidden inside a collection of ordinary hospital papers that almost disappeared forever. He unlocked his private office, placed the folder beside his computer, and requested every document connected to his recovery, including legal correspondence, insurance summaries, visitor authorizations, and archived medical deliveries. His administrative staff responded quickly, assuming the request related to routine compliance. No one questioned why their employer suddenly wanted to revisit a chapter of his life he had avoided discussing for months. By late morning, digital records began arriving one file after another. Damien compared every official summary against the original copies Grace had preserved. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Visitor names had been shortened or removed. Handwritten observations had disappeared entirely. Authorization forms had been rewritten into simplified legal summaries. Each revision appeared harmless when viewed alone, but together they created an entirely different version of history. Someone had not changed one document. Someone had rewritten an entire story. Damien leaned back in his chair as another memory quietly returned. Only 3 days after leaving the hospital, his longtime executive advisor, Charles Whitmore, had personally delivered a polished briefing explaining everything that supposedly happened during his recovery. Charles had assured him every document had already been reviewed by attorneys, hospital administrators, and compliance officers. Damien had trusted him without hesitation because trust had never seemed dangerous. Now he opened the archived delivery log included with the newly requested records. Every official medical summary had passed through Charles's office before reaching him, despite hospital policy recommending direct delivery whenever possible. Damien frowned, but refused to reach conclusions too quickly. Assumptions had nearly destroyed one innocent life already. He continued reading. Another routing record appeared. Then another. Every revised document carried the same internal authorization approving additional administrative handling before final distribution. The approving signature belonged to Charles Whitmore. Damien remained completely still. It was not proof of guilt, but it was no longer possible to dismiss the growing pattern as coincidence. He contacted the hospital compliance department requesting an independent verification of the original archive history without mentioning Charles by name. Less than an hour later, the compliance director confirmed that no medical records should have been altered after the recovery unit completed its documentation. Clerical corrections could fix spelling or formatting, but they could never remove documented visitors, nursing observations, or signed treatment authorizations. Damien thanked the director and quietly ended the call. Outside his office window, the city moved through another ordinary business day, unaware that one conversation had just changed everything he believed about the people closest to him. He opened the folder one final time and compared Grace's preserved copies against the official archive. Every missing detail pointed toward the same uncomfortable conclusion. The lie had not been created inside the hospital. It had begun only after the truth left it. Damien slowly closed the folder and looked toward the framed photograph resting face down on his desk. For months, he had searched for betrayal in the wrong direction. Now he realized the person responsible for shaping his anger had been standing beside him almost every day, offering advice with calm confidence, while carefully making certain the real story never reached his hands. Damien reached for the office phone and instructed his assistant to schedule a private meeting with Charles at 9 o'clock the following morning. There would be no accusations, no raised voices, and no public confrontation. This time, Damien intended to let the truth speak before anyone else had the opportunity to rewrite it again. The next morning arrived with the quiet confidence that always surrounded important decisions. But Damien entered the executive conference room, carrying something far more powerful than authority. He carried certainty earned through truth instead of assumption. Floor-to-ceiling windows welcomed the early sunlight across the polished walnut table where weekly strategy meetings had taken place for years without interruption. At precisely 9 o'clock, Charles Whitmore entered with his usual calm professionalism, carrying a leather portfolio and offering the familiar smile of a trusted advisor who believed the morning would unfold like every other. Damien invited him to take a seat before dismissing everyone else from the room. Once the door closed, silence settled comfortably between them. Damien placed Grace's medical folder beside a neatly organized stack of official reports collected from Sullivan Holdings and St. Catherine Medical Center. He did not begin with accusations. Instead, he slid two nearly identical visitor authorization forms across the table. "Tell me what you notice," he said quietly. Charles glanced at the pages before answering with practiced confidence. "Administrative revisions. Hospitals make them all the time." Damien nodded slowly and produced another pair of documents. Original nursing observations rested beside the archived summary. The handwritten notes describing the same visitor's daily presence had disappeared from the revised version. Charles remained composed, but the certainty in his voice became noticeably softer. Damien continued placing documents onto the table one by one. Visitor records, recovery notes, authorization forms, archive routing sheets, compliance policies. Every page quietly reinforced the same pattern without requiring dramatic explanation. Finally, Damien rested the routing document at the center of the table. Near the bottom appeared Charles's unmistakable approval signature authorizing the revised package delivered directly to Damien after his discharge. The room became completely silent. Charles lowered his eyes toward the paper before slowly leaning back in his chair. "I suppose you eventually found the originals," he said quietly. Damien never raised his voice. "Why?" Charles remained silent for several moments before answering with unexpected honesty. "Because I believed she weakened your judgment." Damien listened without interruption. Charles folded his hands together. "After your accident, every major project stopped. Investors hesitated. Executives questioned leadership. Whenever she was part of your life, your priorities changed. I convinced myself that removing her from your future would protect everything you had built." Damien looked steadily across the table. "So you rewrote my past." Charles closed his eyes briefly before nodding. "I told myself I was protecting your future." Damien opened the hospital compliance policy and gently turned it toward him. "Protection never requires deception." Charles offered no defense. The confidence that had defined him for years quietly disappeared beneath the undeniable weight of documented truth. Damien pressed the intercom button and asked the company's legal counsel and chief compliance officer to enter the conference room. They arrived carrying notebooks, but quickly realized this meeting was unlike any they had attended before. Damien calmly handed them both the original hospital records and the internally distributed reports. "Please begin an independent review," he said. "I want every conclusion supported only by verified documentation." Neither executive asked unnecessary questions. They simply accepted the files and acknowledged the instruction. Charles slowly stood, gathering nothing from the table except a quiet understanding that his explanation would never erase what had already happened. Before leaving, he looked toward Damien one final time. "I believed I knew what was best for you." Damien answered with gentle conviction rather than anger. The moment someone decides another person should live according to a lie, they stop being a trusted advisor and become the author of someone else's pain. After the conference room door closed, Damien remained alone beneath the morning sunlight. Months earlier, he would have considered exposing the truth his greatest victory. Now he understood something far more important. Discovering who created the lie mattered, but deciding what kind of man he would become after learning the truth mattered even more. The days that followed passed quietly, yet for Damien, nothing felt ordinary anymore. The independent review progressed exactly as he had requested, guided only by original records, documented evidence, and verified timelines. No assumptions were allowed. No conclusions were accepted without proof. For the first time since leaving the hospital, he realized that truth required patience, while anger had always demanded speed. 3 days later, the review reached its conclusion. The original hospital documents were confirmed as authentic, and every alteration made after his discharge had been traced through administrative handling outside the medical staff who cared for him. St. Catherine Medical Center formally restored the original records to his permanent file, ensuring that every visitor log, nursing observation, and treatment authorization reflected what had actually happened during those difficult weeks. No public announcement followed. There were no reporters, no dramatic headlines, and no celebration. The greatest corrections often happened quietly because genuine integrity never needed an audience. That afternoon, Damien returned to the hospital carrying the same medical folder Grace had first placed before him. The familiar scent of fresh coffee drifted through the main lobby while nurses hurried between patient rooms with calm determination. Families waited patiently beside elevators, holding flowers, balloons, and hopeful smiles. Life continued exactly as it had before, reminding Damien that ordinary kindness often accomplished extraordinary things without anyone noticing. Grace had just finished helping an elderly patient prepare for discharge when she saw Damien standing near the recovery wing. She smiled with quiet surprise but showed no expectation that he had come to thank her. "Everything is finished," Damien said softly. Grace studied his expression before asking only one question. "Did you find the truth?" Damien nodded. "Every part of it that could still be found." He gently handed her the folder. "These belong here more than they ever belonged to me." Grace accepted the folder carefully, running her hand across its worn cover before placing it against her chest once again. "I never wanted credit," she said quietly. "I only wanted the right story to survive." Damien smiled with genuine warmth for the first time in many months. "You protected something far more valuable than documents." Grace looked at him with gentle curiosity. Damien continued, "You protected the version of me that would have disappeared forever if I had followed my anger instead of your courage." Neither of them spoke for several moments. Through the large windows beside the recovery wing, warm afternoon sunlight settled across the polished floor, while nurses greeted new patients with the same compassion they offered every day. Damien finally broke the silence. "Tomorrow, I am meeting the woman I misunderstood." Grace nodded gently. "Then do not begin with explanations." Damien looked toward her. Grace smiled softly. "Begin with listening. The truth gave you another chance. Let her decide what to do with it." Those simple words stayed with Damien as he prepared to leave. Before walking away, he paused beside a quiet hallway where months earlier he had spent countless days without remembering any of them. Closing his eyes for only a moment, he could almost hear a familiar voice reading beside his hospital bed, encouraging him to keep fighting even when he could not answer. The memory no longer felt distant or uncertain. It finally belonged where it always should have. As Damien stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, he realized revenge had once promised him satisfaction, but truth had given him something infinitely more valuable. It had returned his ability to choose compassion before hatred became the only story he remembered. Several weeks later, winter settled gently across Manhattan, covering rooftops and quiet sidewalks with a thin layer of snow that softened even the busiest streets. Life had continued moving forward, yet Damien no longer measured success by the number of agreements he signed or the influence he carried into every boardroom. Some victories could never be counted because they changed the heart instead of the balance sheet. The private meeting Grace had encouraged finally took place inside a quiet botanical garden overlooking the river. There were no attorneys, no advisors, no security teams standing nearby. Only two people separated by months of misunderstanding and one truth that had almost arrived too late. Damien greeted the woman he had wrongly blamed with quiet humility rather than confidence. Before she could speak, he simply said, "I believed a story that was never true, and I allowed that story to replace the trust you earned. I cannot return the months that my silence and anger took from us, but I can accept full responsibility for believing a lie before asking for the truth." She remained silent for several moments, studying the sincerity in his eyes instead of searching for perfect words. Finally, she answered with calm honesty, "Sometimes losing trust hurts more than losing love." Damien lowered his head because he knew she was right. Neither of them tried to erase the past. Instead, they chose to acknowledge it with the dignity both had deserved from the beginning. Whether their future would bring friendship, forgiveness, or simply peace no longer mattered as much as allowing honesty to stand where deception once had. Days later, Damien returned to St. Catherine Medical Center carrying no cameras, no reporters, and no prepared speech. He quietly established a permanent patient support foundation dedicated to families facing unexpected medical emergencies, ensuring that no one would ever delay life-saving decisions because they felt alone or overwhelmed. He refused to attach his own name to the program. Instead, the dedication displayed only a simple inscription: "In honor of those who protect hope when no one is watching." Grace discovered the plaque by accident while walking through the hospital lobby after another long shift. She smiled softly, understanding immediately why no signature appeared beneath the words. Recognition had never been the purpose. Preserving compassion had always mattered more. As she prepared to leave for the evening, Damien happened to pass through the lobby once again. Their eyes met briefly before he offered a quiet smile, filled with genuine gratitude. "You did not only protect medical records," he said softly. "You protected the person I still had the chance to become." Grace answered with the same quiet kindness that had first stopped him in the hallway weeks earlier. "The truth was always yours. I only refused to let it disappear." Damien stepped outside into the crisp winter air, watching families enter the hospital carrying flowers, warm blankets, and hopeful expressions. He realized that the strongest people he had ever encountered were rarely the loudest or the most powerful. They were the ones who quietly carried compassion through ordinary days without expecting applause. As snow continued falling across the city, Damien finally understood that revenge would have given him only another painful memory, while truth had returned something infinitely greater. It had restored his ability to trust, to listen, to admit when he was wrong, and to honor the quiet courage of people whose goodness asked for nothing in return. And on that peaceful winter afternoon, he learned that the greatest person in any room is never the one with the most power, but the one who chooses dignity even when no one is watching.